I'm Lieutenant Commander Sarah Donovan, 34. I worked my way up from a small-town kid with a military dad to a decorated officer trusted with classified operations. For over a decade, I sent half my pay home, covered my brother's medical bills, and did everything I could to uphold my family's name. But when I was accused of leaking national secrets and my own father walked into a courtroom to testify that I was capable of treason, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been betrayed or humiliated by the very people you sacrificed everything for? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about setting boundaries and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. I stood in the courtroom, watching my father raise his right hand to swear an oath. The same hand that had taught me to salute, to hold a rifle, to sign my first military contract. Now it was raised against me. The charges were clear: unauthorized access to classified files, conspiracy to leak national security information. The evidence seemed damning: login records showing my credentials, file transfers traced to my workstation, encrypted communications found on my personal devices. But I knew I hadn't done any of it. It started 3 months earlier with small things. Dad's questions during our weekly phone calls shifted from the usual parental check-ins to something more pointed. How's work treating you, Sarah? Any interesting cases crossing your desk? When I'd give my standard responses about operational security, he'd press just enough to make it uncomfortable. Come on, sweetheart. It's just your old man asking. The family dynamics had been changing too. Sunday dinners at my parents' house became minefields of awkward jokes. My brother Michael would make comments about government secrets, laughing as he said things like, "Better watch what we say around Lieutenant Commander here. She might report us." My sister Laura would giggle nervously, but their eyes held something I couldn't name then. Something that looked like suspicion. At work, I noticed the shift gradually. Colleagues who used to grab coffee with me started finding excuses to cut conversations short. The IT department flagged unusual activity on my accounts, files accessed at odd hours, systems queries I didn't remember making. When I reported it, thinking it was a security breach, the investigation turned inward instead of outward. Captain Morrison, my direct supervisor, called me into his office on a Tuesday morning in March. His expression was carefully neutral, which in military terms meant trouble. "Sarah, we need to discuss some irregularities in your system access logs." He spread printouts across his desk, timestamps, file names, IP addresses. All traced back to my credentials. "Sir, I can account for most of my work, but some of these timestamps show activity when I was off base entirely. This has to be credential theft or system compromise." I kept my voice steady, professional. Inside, my stomach was dropping. That's what we're hoping to determine. For now, your security clearance is under review. His words hit like a physical blow. A clearance review meant suspension from duty, isolation from my unit, the slow dissolution of everything I'd worked 12 years to build. The whispers started immediately. In the commissary, conversations stopped when I walked by. Fellow officers who'd served alongside me in Afghanistan suddenly couldn't meet my eyes. The rumor mill in any military installation runs on high-octane fuel, and suspected traitors are premium content. I tried talking to Dad about it during one of our calls. "I'm dealing with some administrative issues at work," I said carefully. "Nothing serious, but it might mean some schedule changes." His response chilled me. "Sarah, if you've gotten yourself into something you can't handle, you need to come clean now. The longer you wait, the worse it gets." There was no surprise in his voice, no shock at the possibility his daughter might be under investigation. Just resignation, as if he'd been expecting this call. "Dad, I haven't done anything wrong." "That's what everyone says, sweetheart. But the evidence doesn't lie." "The evidence." He spoke like he knew what evidence existed, like he'd already seen the case files. That conversation replayed in my mind for days afterward. How could he know about evidence in an ongoing investigation? How could he be so certain I was guilty when I hadn't even told him the details? The formal charges came down 6 weeks later. conspiracy to commit espionage, unauthorized disclosure of classified information, violation of the Espionage Act. The kind of charges that destroy careers and send people to federal prison for decades. The kind of charges that make families disown you to protect themselves. My lawyer, Captain Harper, was a good man with a reputation for fighting impossible cases. When we met to discuss strategy, his first question surprised me. "Sarah, I need you to walk me through your family relationships. Any tensions, any financial pressures, anything that might explain why someone would want to frame you." My family has always been supportive. Dad's retired military himself, Colonel Richard Donovan. He understands the service, the sacrifices. My siblings have their own lives, but we're close. Even as I said it, recent memory contradicted me. The strange questions, the jokes that weren't quite jokes, the way conversations died when I entered rooms. I ask because family testimony can be particularly damaging in security clearance cases. Juries tend to believe that blood relatives have no reason to lie. Harper's experience showed in his careful phrasing. He wasn't just preparing legal strategy, he was preparing me for the possibility of betrayal. The pretrial hearings began in August. Military courtrooms are austere places, designed to emphasize duty and order over emotion. I sat at the defense table in my dress uniform, ribbons and insignia marking 12 years of faithful service. Across the aisle, Major Steele, the prosecutor, arranged her evidence with methodical precision. She called her first witness on the second day, Colonel Richard Donovan, retired, father of the accused. Dad walked to the witness stand with the same bearing he'd carried throughout his career. Shoulders back, eyes forward, every step measured. He didn't look at me as he passed the defense table. When the bailiff asked him to state his name for the record, his voice carried the same authority it had when I was 7 years old and in trouble for tracking mud through the house. Major Steele approached with practiced deference. "Colonel Donovan, you've served this country with distinction for 28 years. Thank you for your service." "It was my honor." "You're also the father of the accused, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Donovan. That must make this testimony particularly difficult." Dad's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My personal feelings are irrelevant. I'm here to provide truthful testimony about what I know." "And what do you know about your daughter's recent behavior?" The courtroom fell silent. I could hear the ventilation system, the scratch of the court reporter's stylus, my own heartbeat. Dad looked straight ahead, not at me, not at the prosecutor, just into some middle distance where duty lived. "My daughter has always been impulsive, strong-willed to the point of recklessness. As a child, she would take risks that endangered herself and others. She never learned to respect boundaries." His voice never wavered, never showed emotion. He might have been reading a weather report. "Did you observe this pattern continuing into her adult life?" "Yes. She's made financial decisions without consulting family, career moves that seemed driven more by ego than wisdom. When she was deployed, her letters home suggested she was frustrated with command structure, with rules she saw as arbitrary." I stared at him, feeling something break inside my chest. The letters he mentioned, I'd written them during the worst months of my second deployment, when we were losing people to improvised explosives and bureaucratic delays in getting better armor. I'd shared my frustrations with someone I trusted, someone I thought would understand the weight of command responsibility. Major Steele pressed forward. "Colonel, based on your knowledge of your daughter's character, her access to classified materials, and her expressed frustrations with military policy, do you believe she's capable of leaking national security information?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Dad's hands remained steady on the witness stand rail. When he spoke, his words were measured, final. "My daughter has always believed her judgment was superior to established authority. If she convinced herself that releasing classified information served some greater good, yes, I believe she would cross that line." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Major Steele nodded with satisfaction. Captain Harper objected to something, but I couldn't hear him over the sound of my world collapsing. My own father had just testified that I was a traitor. I grew up in a house where duty wasn't discussed, it was simply expected. Dad's study was lined with commendations, unit photographs, and books about military history. The message was clear: service before self, country before comfort, honor above all else. He'd enlisted as an 18-year-old kid from Ohio and worked his way up through sheer determination and an ability to make hard decisions without flinching. By the time I was born, he was already a captain, already building the reputation that would carry him to colonel. Mom used to joke that he married the Army first and her second, but there was truth in it. The Army shaped everything in our house: meal times, bedtimes, weekend activities, vacation schedules. I followed his path because it made sense. The military offered structure, purpose, and a chance to serve something larger than myself. When I graduated from the Naval Academy, Dad was in the front row, his chest puffed with pride. When I received my first commission, he administered the oath himself. When I made lieutenant commander ahead of schedule, he called everyone he knew to share the news. For 12 years, I believed I was living up to his example. I took the hard assignments, the overseas deployments, the positions nobody else wanted. During my first tour in Afghanistan, I sent half my pay home to help with Laura's college expenses and Michael's medical bills after his accident. When Dad needed surgery 2 years ago, I used my leave to stay with Mom and coordinate his care. The sacrifices felt meaningful because they were part of a family tradition of service. Dad had given his career to defend the country, and I was continuing that legacy. Every promotion, every commendation, every successful mission felt like validation that I was worthy of the name Donovan. Our Sunday dinners were institutions, mandatory unless you were deployed or hospitalized. Dad would hold court at the head of the table, sharing stories from his active duty days while Mom served pot roast and mashed potatoes. Michael and Laura would update everyone on their civilian lives, and I'd offer carefully sanitized versions of my work. Dad's questions always seemed interested, paternal, appropriate. Until they weren't. The shift was so gradual I almost missed it. Instead of asking how I was adjusting to my new assignment, he'd want to know about specific cases, particular operations, details that crossed into operational security. When I'd deflect with humor or change the subject, he'd push just enough to make the conversation uncomfortable. "Come on, Sarah. You're talking to family here. We understand the importance of what you do. But understanding and clearance are different things." I'd spent years learning the boundaries, the protocols, the absolute requirements for protecting classified information. Dad knew those same rules. He'd lived by them for nearly 3 decades. His questions weren't innocent curiosity, they were testing something. Laura started making jokes about government secrets, laughing as she said things like, "Better be careful what we talk about with Big Sister here. She might have to kill us." Michael would chime in with comments about surveillance and cover-ups. The jokes had edges, implications that I was somehow separate from the family now, that my work made me dangerous or untrustworthy. Mom never participated in the jokes, but she didn't stop them either. She'd focus on serving food or clearing dishes, avoiding the conversations entirely. Looking back, I think she sensed the undercurrent but couldn't bring herself to name it. Confrontation had never been her strength. The family dynamics were shifting in ways I couldn't quite articulate. Conversations that used to flow naturally became stilted. Topics that had never been off-limits suddenly felt forbidden. When I'd arrive for dinner, there would be a moment of silence, as if they'd been talking about something they couldn't discuss in front of me. I started making excuses to miss dinners. Work obligations, social commitments, anything that would let me avoid the growing tension. Dad would express disappointment, but there was something else in his voice, relief, maybe, or vindication. As if my absence proved something he'd already suspected. The last normal conversation we had was in February, 3 weeks before the investigation began. I'd stopped by their house to drop off birthday gifts for Mom. Dad was in his study, reading military journals and making notes in the margins. When he saw me, he closed the journal and gestured for me to sit. "How are things really going, Sarah?" Not the official version, the truth. I should have been glad he was asking. For months, I'd felt like he was treating me as a security risk instead of his daughter. This felt like an opening, a chance to reconnect. "Things are good, Dad. Challenging work, good people, opportunities for advancement." I'm exactly where I want to be. He nodded slowly, studying my face like he was looking for tells in a poker game. The work you're doing now, it's important? Sensitive. All military work is important. And yes, some of it requires security clearances. I kept my voice light, but something in his question bothered me. The phrasing was too specific, too pointed. Just remember, sweetheart, that loyalty has limits. Sometimes doing the right thing means making hard choices about who deserves the truth. At the time, I thought he was giving me fatherly advice about leadership, about the difficult decisions that come with rank and responsibility. Now I understand he was preparing me for what he was about to do. He was warning me that his loyalty to his principles would outweigh his loyalty to me. 3 weeks later, the investigation began. 6 weeks after that, he was testifying against me in a military courtroom, telling a prosecutor that his own daughter was capable of treason. 12 years of service reduced to character assassination. A lifetime of trust destroyed by the man who'd taught me the meaning of honor in the first place. I sat in my quarters after the first day of testimony, staring at the dress uniform hanging in my closet. The ribbons told the story of my career. The Navy Achievement Medal from my first assignment, the Joint Service Commendation Medal from Afghanistan, the Defense Meritorious Service Medal from my last performance review. Each one represented months or years of work, of proving myself worthy of trust and responsibility. Tomorrow, the prosecution would continue building their case. Major Steele had more witnesses lined up, more evidence to present, more reasons why Lieutenant Commander Sarah Donovan should be convicted of betraying her country. But today had been the worst of it. Today, my own father had looked a jury in the eye and told them I was a traitor. The media coverage was brutal. Military publications that had once featured my promotions now ran headlines about the Donovan scandal. Online forums where service members discussed careers and assignments lit up with speculation about my guilt. Former colleagues who'd served with me were quoted anonymously, some defending my character, others expressing shock and disappointment. My phone stopped ringing. Text messages dwindled to nothing. The isolation was complete and deliberate. Anyone who might face their own security review for associating with me had practical reasons to maintain distance. I understood the logic, but understanding didn't make it hurt less. Captain Harper visited me that evening to discuss the next day's strategy. Sarah, I have to ask, is there anything in your background, any relationship or financial pressure or personal issue that might explain why someone would want to frame you? I'd been thinking about that question for weeks. Who had access to my credentials? Who knew enough about my work patterns to make the false evidence convincing? Who had motive to destroy my career? The only people who know me well enough to pull this off are family and close colleagues. My colleagues have no reason to frame me and my family. I stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Your family what? My family testified against me today. Harper nodded grimly. Family testimony is particularly damaging because juries assume relatives have no reason to lie. But it also means family members have unique access to personal information that could be used against you. The implications were staggering. If someone in my family was involved in framing me, then Dad's testimony wasn't just betrayal, it was part of a coordinated plan. The strange questions, the pointed jokes, the growing distance, it could all have been orchestration instead of coincidence. But why? What did my family gain from my destruction? What threat did I pose that justified this level of betrayal? I spent that night replaying conversations, analyzing interactions, looking for clues I'd missed. Dad's questions about my work, Michael's comments about taking falls quietly, Laura's eagerness to distance herself from anything controversial, patterns that seemed innocent individually but formed a disturbing picture when viewed together. The evidence against me was sophisticated, carefully constructed, and precisely targeted. Someone had invested significant time and effort in building a case that would be difficult to defend against. Someone who knew my routines, my access patterns, my security protocols. Someone who understood how military justice worked and how to manipulate it. Someone who knew me well enough to predict exactly how I'd react to being accused of treason, with anger, with defiance, with a determination to fight that could be painted as arrogance and guilt. The next morning brought fresh headlines and new testimony. Major Steele called a parade of witnesses, IT specialists who explained the technical evidence, colleagues who testified about my access to classified systems, supervisors who confirmed my clearance levels and responsibilities. Each piece of testimony felt like another nail in a coffin I hadn't built but couldn't escape. The prosecution's case was methodical, comprehensive, and devastating. By the end of the week, even I was starting to wonder if I'd somehow committed crimes I couldn't remember. But doubt is a luxury the accused can't afford. Somewhere in the maze of evidence and testimony was the truth, and the truth was that I hadn't betrayed my country. Someone else had, and they'd been clever enough to make me look guilty. The question was whether Captain Harper and I could find them before the jury decided my fate. The prosecution rested their case on a Friday afternoon. The weekend gave me time to think, to prepare for what came next. Monday would bring our chance to present a defense, to challenge the evidence, to offer alternative explanations for the digital trail that seemed to lead directly to me. I knew the odds were against us. Military juries take security violations seriously, and the evidence looked damning. But I also knew I was innocent, and somewhere in the complexity of this case was proof of that innocence. I just had to survive long enough to find it. The family pressure started immediately after Dad's testimony. Michael called that evening, his voice tight with anger and embarrassment. "Sarah, this is getting out of hand. Dad's reputation is on the line now and Mom's falling apart. You need to think about what's best for everyone." "What's best for everyone is the truth, Michael. I didn't do what they're accusing me of. Look, maybe I didn't mean to leak anything. Maybe it was just poor judgment, or you trusted the wrong person. But fighting this is making it worse for everybody. If you just accept some kind of plea deal, we could all move on." The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. My brother was asking me to confess to crimes I didn't commit to make things easier for the family. "You want me to plead guilty to treason? I want you to be realistic. The evidence is overwhelming, and now Dad's testified that you're capable of this kind of thing. Fighting it just makes you look arrogant and guilty. Take responsibility, accept the consequences, and maybe we can salvage something." I hung up on him. 20 minutes later, Laura called with essentially the same message, though she delivered it with more tears and less direct anger. "Sarah, please, just think about Mom and Dad. They've suffered enough. Can't you just make this go away? By confessing to something I didn't do? By accepting that sometimes taking responsibility is more important than being right." This became the family narrative over the following days. I was being selfish, arrogant, stubborn. I was putting my pride ahead of their welfare. I was dragging the Donovan name through the mud for no good reason. Mom was the only one who didn't call with advice, but when I finally reached her, the conversation was heartbreaking. "I don't know what to believe anymore, Sarah. Your father seems so certain, and Michael says the evidence is clear. But you're my daughter, and I want to believe you. I just don't know how." Her confusion was genuine, painful, and completely understandable. The people she trusted most were telling her contradictory things. Dad and Michael presented certainty based on evidence and testimony. I offered protestations of innocence with no proof to back them up. From her perspective, someone she loved was lying to her. The question was whether it was her husband and son or her daughter. Captain Harper advised me to limit contact with my family during the trial. "They've already testified against you in pre-trial proceedings. Anything you say to them now could be used to impeach your credibility later. And frankly, Sarah, they don't seem to be supporting you anyway." That was the hardest part, not just being betrayed, but being abandoned. In the military, you learn to depend on your unit, to trust that the people beside you will have your back when things go bad. I'd expected that same loyalty from my family, especially given their own military background. Instead, they were treating me like a liability to be managed, a problem to be solved, a source of embarrassment to be contained. The message was clear: admit guilt, accept punishment, and spare them further association with scandal. But I couldn't do it. Not just because I was innocent, but because accepting false guilt would validate every accusation they'd made. It would confirm that I was weak, reckless, and unworthy of trust. It would mean that Dad's testimony was accurate, that his assessment of my character was correct. The courtroom became my refuge because it was the only place where the truth mattered more than family politics. Major Steele could present evidence, call witnesses, and build a case, but she had to follow rules of procedure and proof. She couldn't simply declare me guilty because it was convenient. Captain Harper began our defense by challenging the technical evidence. He called expert witnesses who testified about credential theft, system vulnerabilities, and the possibility that someone else had used my access to commit the crimes. The testimony was complex, technical, and difficult for a jury to follow, but it established reasonable doubt about the prosecution's narrative. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Harper said in his opening statement, "the prosecution wants you to believe that Lieutenant Commander Donovan deliberately betrayed her country for unknown motives, using methods that would guarantee her detection, leaving a digital trail that led directly back to her." Does this sound like the behavior of someone trying to commit espionage or someone being framed for it? It was a good argument, but arguments don't override evidence. We needed something more substantial than technical possibilities and alternative theories. We needed proof that someone else was responsible. That proof came from an unexpected source. During the prosecution's case, Major Steele had presented system logs showing unusual access patterns on my workstation. Harper's technical expert noticed something in those same logs that the prosecution had missed: access attempts from IP addresses that couldn't be traced to any authorized user. Someone was probing the system, testing access methods, learning how to navigate the security protocols, the expert testified. These weren't the actions of an authorized user like Commander Donovan. These were reconnaissance activities, the kind of preliminary work you'd expect from someone planning unauthorized access. The testimony was technical and hard to follow, but it suggested that my credentials had been compromised by someone with sophisticated knowledge of military computer systems. Someone who understood security protocols, access patterns, and audit procedures well enough to cover their tracks. Someone with their own military background and knowledge of how these systems worked. As our defense developed, I started seeing my family situation differently. Dad's questions hadn't been innocent curiosity, they'd been intelligence gathering. Michael's suggestions about taking the fall weren't brotherly advice, they were damage control. Laura's distance wasn't protective, it was calculated. The possibility that my own family had framed me was almost too horrible to consider. But the evidence was pointing in that direction, and the alternative, that I was actually guilty of treason, was something I knew to be false. By the end of our second week of defense testimony, I was sitting alone at the defense table every day. No family members in the gallery, no colleagues offering support, no friends willing to risk association with an accused traitor. Just me, Captain Harper, and the slow accumulation of evidence that someone very clever had destroyed my life. The question was whether we could prove who that someone was before the jury reached their verdict. Just as Captain Harper was preparing for closing arguments, the courtroom doors opened with unusual commotion. The bailiff announced, "The Honorable Secretary of Defense, Mr. Robert Hayes." Secretary Hayes walked down the center aisle with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Behind him, two aides carried briefcases and what appeared to be technical equipment. The judge looked surprised but gestured for the secretary to approach. "Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption, but new evidence has come to light that directly impacts this case. With the court's permission, I'd like to present material that may exonerate the accused." Major Steele objected immediately. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The prosecution has had no opportunity to review whatever evidence the Secretary intends to present." Secretary Hayes stepped forward. "Major, what I'm about to show you will make the prosecution's case irrelevant." "Your Honor, this evidence comes from a classified investigation that has been running parallel to these proceedings. I have authorization from the highest levels to declassify specific materials for use in this courtroom." The judge looked uncertain. Military protocol demanded respect for the Secretary's authority, but courtroom procedure required proper evidence handling. After a brief conference with the bailiff and court reporter, he made his decision. "Secretary Hayes, you may present your evidence. Major Steele, Captain Harper, you'll both have opportunity to examine and respond to whatever is presented." Secretary Hayes nodded to his aides, who set up a large monitor at the front of the courtroom. "Your Honor, what you're about to see is surveillance footage from the secure facility where the alleged security breaches occurred. This footage was classified during the original investigation, but recent analysis has revealed its significance to this case. The monitor flickered to life, showing a corridor I recognized, the hallway outside the secure computer facility at my base. The timestamp showed a date from 3 months ago, during the period when the alleged breaches occurred. For several minutes, the footage showed normal traffic, authorized personnel entering and exiting with proper procedures. Then a figure appeared on screen that made the entire courtroom gasp. Commander Daniel Brooks, an officer I'd worked with for 2 years, was systematically accessing my workstation using what appeared to be cloned credentials. The footage showed him inserting a USB device, transferring files, and carefully covering his tracks. His movements were deliberate, practiced, professional. Ladies and gentlemen, Secretary Hayes continued, what you're seeing is the actual perpetrator of the security breaches for which Lieutenant Commander Donovan has been charged. Commander Brooks had legitimate access to the facility, detailed knowledge of security protocols, and the technical skills necessary to clone credentials and manipulate audit logs. The courtroom was dead silent except for the quiet hum of the video equipment. On screen, Brooks completed his work and left the facility, checking the hallway carefully before departing. The timestamp showed this occurring at 0347 hours, well outside normal duty schedules, at a time when I had documented alibi placing me off base entirely. Major Steele looked stunned. Your Honor, I need time to verify this evidence, to understand how it impacts our case. Major, there's more. Secretary Hayes signaled his aide, who began playing a second video file. This footage is from Commander Brooks' personal quarters, obtained through a warrant issued yesterday morning. The second video showed Brooks in civilian clothes, working at a personal computer. Audio accompanied this footage, and Brooks' voice was clearly audible as he made phone calls and spoke to someone off camera. The upload is complete. Donovan's credentials are burned now. The audit trail leads directly back to her. She'll never be able to prove she didn't do it. A voice off camera responded, but it was muffled, indistinct. Brooks continued, your information about her work patterns was perfect. The timing, the access methods, everything looks exactly like something she would do if she were actually guilty. My blood ran cold. Someone had been feeding Brooks information about my routines, my access patterns, my work schedule. Someone who knew me well enough to make the frame-up convincing. The voice-off camera spoke again, and this time it was clear enough for the courtroom to hear. Just make sure the evidence is solid. Sarah's stubborn. She'll fight this if there's any weakness in the case. The voice belonged to my brother Michael. The courtroom erupted. Spectators gasped, reporters scribbled frantically, and the judge called for order. At the prosecution table, Major Steele was visibly shaken. At the defense table, Captain Harper was trying not to smile. But I wasn't watching any of them. I was staring at the gallery, where my parents sat in the third row. Mom's face had gone completely white. Dad was staring at the screen with an expression I'd never seen before, not surprise, but resignation. The look of someone whose carefully constructed plan had just collapsed. Secretary Hayes waited for quiet before continuing. Your Honor, Commander Brooks was arrested this morning and has provided a full confession in exchange for cooperation. His statement implicates several co-conspirators, including family members of the accused who provided inside information about Lieutenant Commander Donovan's work patterns and personal habits. The secretary paused, looking directly at my parents. The conspiracy to frame Lieutenant Commander Donovan was motivated by financial considerations. Commander Brooks was selling classified information to foreign contacts and needed a scapegoat when the investigation began. The accused's own family members participated in the frame-up in exchange for payment and protection from prosecution. The words hit me like physical blows. My family hadn't just betrayed me, they'd actively participated in framing me for treason. Dad's testimony wasn't misguided loyalty to truth. It was calculated perjury, designed to ensure my conviction. Michael's calls urging me to plead guilty weren't brotherly concern. They were attempts to guarantee I wouldn't fight the charges effectively. Laura's distance wasn't self-protection. It was guilt over her participation in destroying my life. They had sold me out for money and their own safety. Secretary Hayes concluded his presentation with devastating efficiency. Your Honor, the charges against Lieutenant Commander Donovan are hereby dropped. The evidence clearly shows she was the victim of an elaborate conspiracy, not the perpetrator of security breaches. Commander Brooks and his co-conspirators will face appropriate charges for their crimes. Judge Morrison looked around the courtroom, taking in the stunned faces, the scattered papers, the complete collapse of the prosecution's case. Major Steele, do you have any response to this evidence? Major Steele stood slowly, her professional composure barely intact. Your Honor, in light of this new evidence, the prosecution withdraws all charges against Lieutenant Commander Donovan. We apologize to the accused and to this court for the time and resources expended on what appears to have been a fraudulent case. The judge turned to me. Lieutenant Commander Donovan, you're free to go. This court extends its apologies for the ordeal you've endured. Your record will be cleared, and you'll receive full back pay and benefits for the period of your suspension. I should have felt relief, vindication, triumph. Instead, I felt empty. The truth had set me free, but it had also revealed the complete betrayal of everyone I'd trusted most. My family hadn't just failed to support me, they'd actively worked to destroy me. Captain Harper was shaking my hand, congratulating me, talking about restoration of reputation and career prospects. Secretary Hayes approached to offer his personal apologies and assurances about my future in the service. But I wasn't listening to any of them. I was watching my parents in the gallery, seeing the moment they realized their world had ended just as mine was being restored. Dad's shoulders sagged with the weight of exposure. Mom covered her face with her hands, sobbing quietly. In the hallway outside, I could hear commotion as reporters tried to interview Michael, who had apparently been arrested along with Brooks. Justice had been served, but justice doesn't repair broken trust or heal betrayed love. It just establishes what actually happened and ensures appropriate consequences. As I left the courtroom that day, I was officially vindicated, professionally restored, and personally destroyed. The conspiracy had failed, but the damage to my family was complete and irreversible. The truth had set me free, but freedom felt nothing like I'd expected it to. In the weeks following my exoneration, the full scope of the conspiracy became clear through court documents and media reports. Michael had gambling debts that threatened his financial stability. Laura was facing expensive medical bills for her daughter's chronic condition. Dad was looking at reduced retirement benefits due to changes in military pension calculations. Commander Brooks had approached them systematically, offering solutions to their financial problems in exchange for information about my work habits, access patterns, and personal routines. The initial request seemed innocent, just details about my schedule, my workstation setup, my security protocols. By the time they realized they were participating in a frame-up, they were too deeply involved to back out. Brooks had recordings of their conversations, evidence of payments, documentation that would implicate them as co-conspirators if the truth came out. So they doubled down. Dad's testimony wasn't just betrayal, it was self-preservation. Michael's pressure for me to plead guilty was designed to end the investigation before it could expose their involvement. Laura's distance was calculated to avoid appearing too connected to someone they were helping to destroy. The irony was bitter. They'd betrayed me to solve financial problems, but their betrayal guaranteed they'd face far worse financial and legal consequences than their original difficulties. Michael received a military court-martial for conspiracy and fraud. His civilian career was destroyed, his security clearance permanently revoked, his reputation ruined. The gambling debts he'd tried to solve through conspiracy were now compounded by legal fees and civil judgments. Laura avoided criminal charges by cooperating with investigators, but her medical license was suspended pending review. The medical bills she'd worried about were now insignificant compared to the legal and professional costs of her involvement in the conspiracy. Dad faced the most serious consequences. Perjury in a military courtroom, conspiracy to commit espionage, and abuse of his former position's credibility carried sentences that would likely keep him in prison for the rest of his life. His military pension was revoked, his honors stripped, his legacy destroyed. Mom, who apparently had limited knowledge of the conspiracy, avoided criminal charges, but faced social and financial ruin. Their house was seized as part of asset forfeiture proceedings. Her friends and community connections evaporated as the scandal became public. The family I'd spent my life trying to honor and support had destroyed themselves trying to destroy me. Their financial problems, which I would have helped solve if they'd simply asked, became catastrophic through their chosen solution. I watched their legal proceedings from a distance, no longer feeling the anger that had sustained me during my own trial. Instead, there was just sadness for what we'd all lost and clarity about what I needed to do next. My military career was officially restored, but the emotional foundation that had motivated my service was gone. I'd served partly to honor my father's example, partly to protect the family that had raised me. With that family revealed as the source of my persecution, the meaning of service had to be redefined. Captain Harper suggested I write a book, give interviews, capitalize on the media attention surrounding my case. "You're a symbol now, Sarah. People see you as someone who survived betrayal and conspiracy. There's value in that story." But I wasn't interested in becoming a symbol or profiting from trauma. I was interested in rebuilding a life based on new foundations, different loyalties, revised understanding of trust and family. The military offered me choice assignments, fast-track promotion opportunities, chances to rebuild my reputation and advance my career. The Navy wanted to demonstrate that they protected innocent officers, that justice ultimately prevailed in their system. I accepted a posting to the Pentagon, working on policy development for military intelligence protocols. The work was important, challenging, and completely removed from the operational environment where the conspiracy had targeted me. It was a chance to start over professionally while contributing to systemic improvements that might prevent other officers from facing similar false accusations. The personal rebuilding was harder than the professional restoration. Trust, once shattered completely, doesn't heal through vindication alone. I found myself analyzing every conversation, questioning every relationship, looking for hidden motives in simple interactions. My colleagues at the Pentagon were respectful but cautious. They knew my story, understood I'd been wrongfully accused, but they also knew that association with scandal, even resolved scandal, could impact their own careers. The conversations were professional, cordial, and carefully limited to work topics. I rented a small apartment in Arlington, close enough to the office for an easy commute, but far enough from my family's former neighborhood to avoid accidental encounters. The space was deliberately minimal, functional furniture, no family photos, no mementos from my previous life. Starting over meant letting go of connections that had proven toxic. The hardest moments came during military ceremonies and social events. Watching other officers with their families, seeing the pride and support I'd once taken for granted, reminded me of what I'd lost. Not just the betrayal, but the innocence of believing that blood relationships guaranteed loyalty. I developed new routines, new friendships, new ways of defining family that didn't depend on biological connections. The officers I worked with became my primary social circle. We shared experiences, values, and commitment to service that felt more reliable than genetic bonds. 6 months after my exoneration, Mom reached out through an intermediary, a family friend who thought enough time had passed for reconciliation. The message was simple. She wanted to see me, to explain her side of what had happened, to rebuild some kind of relationship. I declined. Not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. The investigation had revealed that while Mom hadn't actively participated in the conspiracy, she'd known something was wrong and chosen silence over warning me. Her passive betrayal was almost worse than the active conspiracy. It suggested that preserving family peace mattered more than protecting me from injustice. The friend pressed gently. "Sarah, she's lost everything. Her husband's in prison, her son's facing charges, her daughter's career is ruined. You're the only family she has left. She made her choices when she had the chance to make them. I'm making mine now." That conversation established a boundary that held for the next 2 years. No contact with family members, no involvement in their legal or financial problems, no participation in attempts at reconciliation or explanation. I'd built a new life based on different principles, and protecting that life required maintaining distance from people who'd proven capable of destroying it. My career flourished in ways that surprised me. The policy work was intellectually challenging and systemically important. I was contributing to reforms that would improve security protocols, enhance protection for accused personnel, and prevent the kind of conspiracy that had targeted me. The Navy promoted me to commander ahead of schedule, partly in recognition of my technical contributions and partly as institutional acknowledgement of the injustice I'd survived. The promotion felt earned rather than compensatory. I was advancing based on performance, not sympathy. 3 years after my exoneration, I received orders for a new assignment, executive officer of a destroyer based in Norfolk. It was a significant step toward command, the kind of operational leadership position that had been my goal before the conspiracy derailed my trajectory. The night before I left Washington, I drove past the house where I'd grown up. New owners had renovated extensively, different paint, new landscaping, updated fixtures visible through the windows. The place looked better than it had during my childhood, but it felt completely foreign. I didn't feel nostalgic or sad looking at it. The house represented a chapter of my life that had ended completely, not gradually. The family that had lived there, the relationships that had defined it, the trust that had sustained it, all of that belonged to someone I used to be. Commander Sarah Donovan, the woman driving away from that house toward a new assignment and new responsibilities, was fundamentally different from Lieutenant Commander Sarah Donovan, who had believed family loyalty was reciprocal and trust was earned through years of faithful service. The difference wasn't bitter or angry anymore. It was just factual, the way scars are factual evidence of wounds that have healed. My new ship, USS Resolution, was exactly the kind of command I'd dreamed about during my academy years. Modern systems, experienced crew, challenging mission requirements, and a captain who valued competence over politics. The work was demanding, purposeful, and completely absorbing. For the first time since the conspiracy began, I felt fully engaged with my professional life. The ship demanded complete attention, total commitment, absolute reliability. There was no room for distraction, self-doubt, or emotional baggage. Just the clear requirements of naval service done at the highest level. 6 months into the assignment, I was reviewing personnel files when I noticed something that stopped me cold. One of our junior officers, Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, had a family background that paralleled my own: military father, siblings in financial trouble, recent questions about her security clearance handling. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable. Someone was asking her the same kinds of probing questions my family had asked me. Someone was showing unusual interest in her work routines, her access patterns, her personal relationships. I called Lieutenant Walsh to my stateroom for what I framed as a routine check-in. "How are you settling in aboard Resolution?" "Very well, ma'am. The crew's been supportive and the work is exactly what I hoped for." "Any concerns about the security protocols here? Anything that seems unclear or difficult to follow?" Her hesitation was barely perceptible, but I caught it. "No, ma'am. Everything seems straightforward." "Lieutenant, I'm going to ask you a personal question, and I want you to know that your answer won't affect your fitness reports or career prospects. Has anyone in your family been asking detailed questions about your work lately? Questions that seem to go beyond normal curiosity." The color drained from her face. "Ma'am, how did you?" "Because someone asked me those same questions 3 years ago, right before they tried to destroy my career and my life." "Talk to me, Jennifer. What's been happening?" Over the next hour, she described a pattern that was horrifyingly familiar. Family financial problems, unexpected solutions offered by helpful strangers, requests for information that seemed innocent but grew progressively more specific. The same systematic approach that had targeted me was now targeting her. But this time, I could intervene. This time, I could prevent the conspiracy from succeeding. I spent the next week working with Naval Criminal Investigative Service, sharing my experience, helping them understand how the previous conspiracy had operated. We set up surveillance, monitored communications, documented the approach being made to Lieutenant Walsh's family. The arrest came 2 weeks later. A different commander, a different network, but the same basic scheme. Identify vulnerable officers with family financial pressure, compromise the families, use them to gather intelligence for framing their military relatives. Lieutenant Walsh's career was protected. Her family was extracted from the conspiracy before they became legally culpable. The network was disrupted before it could destroy another innocent officer. Standing in the courtroom watching the conspirators receive their sentences, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my own exoneration, satisfaction that went beyond personal vindication. I'd prevented someone else from experiencing the betrayal and destruction I'd survived. That night, I wrote a letter I'd been avoiding for 3 years. Not to my family, that bridge was permanently burned, but to every military officer I could reach through official and unofficial channels. A detailed explanation of how family-based conspiracies operate, what warning signs to watch for, how to protect yourself when the people you trust most become the source of your destruction. The letter became a Navy-wide training document. My story became a case study in security awareness programs. The conspiracy that had been designed to end my career became the foundation for protecting other officers from similar attacks. Justice doesn't erase betrayal, but it can prevent future betrayals. It can transform personal destruction into systematic protection. It can turn survival into service. Commander Sarah Donovan, executive officer of USS Resolution, was someone I'd become through surviving the worst betrayal imaginable. Not despite the conspiracy, but because of how I'd chosen to respond to it. The family that had raised me was gone forever. The family I'd built through service, through shared values, through proven loyalty under pressure. That family was stronger than blood, more reliable than history, more valuable than the innocence I'd lost. Some betrayals destroy you. Others forge you into someone capable of preventing the same destruction in others. I knew which kind of betrayal I'd survived, and I knew what kind of person it had helped me become. The resolution of my case didn't bring the satisfaction I'd expected. Justice had been served, careers had been destroyed, and conspiracies had been exposed, but none of that repaired the fundamental damage to my understanding of trust and family. 5 years later, I was captain of my own ship, USS Integrity, with a crew of 280 sailors who looked to me for leadership, guidance, and protection. The irony of commanding a ship named Integrity wasn't lost on me. I'd learned the meaning of that word through its complete absence in the people I'd trusted most. My cabin was decorated with commendations, unit awards, and photographs from deployments around the world. No family pictures, no childhood mementos, no connections to the life I'd lived before the conspiracy. The woman in those pictures was someone else, someone naive enough to believe that family loyalty was reciprocal and trust was earned through faithful service. Captain Sarah Donovan had been forged in betrayal and refined through survival. She was harder than the lieutenant commander who'd been framed, more suspicious than the young officer who'd followed her father's example, more careful than the daughter who'd sent half her pay home to help with family expenses. But she was also more purposeful. Every decision I made as captain was informed by understanding what betrayal looked like, how good people could be destroyed by those closest to them, and why protecting my crew meant staying alert to threats that came from unexpected directions. The Navy had promoted me aggressively, partly in recognition of technical competence and partly as institutional acknowledgement of the injustice I'd survived. But the promotions felt earned rather than compensatory. I was advancing because I'd learned lessons that made me better at protecting people under my command. My crew didn't know the details of my history. Military personnel records are confidential, and I didn't discuss personal background with subordinates. But they sensed something in my leadership style that was different from other commanding officers. I was more attentive to personnel problems, more alert to family financial pressures, more suspicious of security irregularities that other commanders might dismiss. Lieutenant Walsh, now a lieutenant commander serving as my executive officer, understood the source of my vigilance. She'd experienced her own near-miss with family-based conspiracy and knew how close she'd come to destruction before intervention saved her career. "Captain," she said during one of our weekly staff meetings, "I've been thinking about the security awareness training we're developing for the fleet. Should we include more specific guidance about family-based threats?" "Absolutely." Most officers think about external threats, foreign intelligence services, criminal organizations. They don't expect their own families to become sources of vulnerability. The conversation was professional, but we both understood the subtext. We'd survived something that most officers never face, and hopefully never will. That survival created obligations to protect others who might face similar threats, to share knowledge that could prevent future conspiracies, to transform personal destruction into systematic improvement. My relationship with my birth family remained completely severed. Michael had served his sentence and was attempting to rebuild his civilian life. Laura had eventually regained her medical license, but practiced in a different state under constant professional scrutiny. Mom had moved to Florida to live with distant relatives who were willing to provide support. Dad had died in prison 2 years earlier. Heart attack, brought on by the stress of imprisonment and the complete collapse of his legacy. I learned about his death through official notification. The Navy informed me because he was my next of kin on old emergency contact forms that had never been updated. I felt nothing when I read the notification. No grief, no relief, no sense of closure. Just acknowledgement that a chapter of my life that had ended years earlier was now officially concluded. The man who'd testified against me, who'd participated in framing me for treason, was gone. The father who'd raised me, who'd taught me about duty and honor, had been revealed as fiction long before his death. I didn't attend the funeral. I didn't send flowers or condolences. I didn't contact surviving family members to offer support or seek reconciliation. The boundaries I'd established after my exoneration remained firm and absolute. Some of my fellow officers found this stance harsh, even cruel. During a conversation with Admiral Stevens, my immediate superior, he raised the subject carefully. "Sarah, I know your family situation is complicated, but your father's death might be an opportunity for healing. Forgiveness can be as much for your benefit as theirs." Admiral, with respect, forgiveness and trust are different things. I might someday forgive what they did, but I'll never again trust people who've proven capable of destroying me for their own convenience. Maintaining boundaries isn't cruelty, it's self-preservation. He nodded thoughtfully. Fair enough. Just remember that isolation can be as dangerous as betrayal if it goes too far. But I wasn't isolated. I'd built new relationships based on proven loyalty, shared values, and mutual respect. My crew, my fellow officers, my professional network, these connections were stronger than blood because they were chosen rather than inherited, earned rather than assumed. The difference was that I no longer confused family with trust or biology with loyalty. The people who mattered in my life were those who'd demonstrated reliability under pressure, who'd proven their integrity through actions rather than words, who'd chosen to support me when support was difficult rather than convenient. Lieutenant Commander Walsh was family in ways that mattered more than genetics. Admiral Stevens was family because he'd advocated for my career when others might have considered me damaged goods. My senior enlisted personnel were family because they'd followed my leadership when leadership was difficult and demanding. This chosen family was smaller than the biological one I'd lost, but it was infinitely more reliable. It was built on foundation of proven character rather than assumed obligation, mutual respect rather than expected loyalty, demonstrated integrity rather than hoped for faithfulness. 10 years after my court-martial, I was selected for promotion to Rear Admiral. The ceremony was held at the Pentagon, with full military honors and traditional pageantry. Admiral Stevens administered the oath while my crew from USS Integrity stood at attention in the audience. As I repeated the words pledging faithful service to the Constitution and the United States, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The conspiracy that was meant to destroy my career had instead revealed who I really was and what I was actually capable of achieving. The family that had betrayed me was gone, replaced by relationships that were stronger because they were chosen rather than assumed. The trust that had been shattered was rebuilt on firmer foundations. The innocence that had been lost was replaced by wisdom that made me better at protecting others. After the ceremony, a young lieutenant approached me hesitantly. "Admiral, I hope you don't mind me asking, but I've heard stories about your early career, about facing false charges. Is it true that your own family testified against you?" I looked at her carefully, seeing something familiar in her expression, the uncertainty of someone facing family pressure she didn't understand, the confusion of someone whose trust was being tested in ways she couldn't name. "Lieutenant, what's your name?" "Jennifer Martinez, ma'am. I'm assigned to Naval Intelligence." "Walk with me, Lieutenant Martinez. Let's talk about family loyalty, professional integrity, and the difference between people who claim to love you and people who actually protect you when protection matters." As we walked through the Pentagon corridors, I began explaining what I'd learned about trust, betrayal, and survival. Another young officer facing the same kinds of pressures I'd once faced, another opportunity to transform personal destruction into systematic protection. The conspiracy against me had failed completely. Not just because I'd been exonerated, but because it had created someone stronger, wiser, and more capable of protecting others from similar destruction. Justice doesn't erase betrayal, but it gives you the strength to walk forward without looking back, and sometimes that's enough to build a life worth living. 10 years had passed since my promotion to Rear Admiral when the call came that would force me to confront the past I thought I'd permanently buried. Vice Admiral Rebecca Torres, Director of Naval Intelligence, requested an immediate meeting at her Pentagon office. "Sarah, we have a situation that requires your specific expertise," she began without preamble. "We've uncovered what appears to be a sophisticated network targeting senior military officers through family manipulation. The operation is larger and more organized than anything we've seen before." She slid a classified folder across her desk. Inside were photographs, communication intercepts, and financial records that painted a disturbing picture. Foreign intelligence services had systematized the approach that had once targeted me, creating an industrial-scale operation to compromise American military personnel through their families. The Chinese Ministry of State Security has been running this program for at least 5 years. They identify officers with access to sensitive information, research their family situations, and then orchestrate financial crises or personal problems that make family members vulnerable to recruitment. I studied the documents, recognizing patterns that were sickeningly familiar. Gambling debts, medical expenses, business failures, all carefully engineered to create desperation that could be exploited. How many officers have been compromised? We're still assessing, but preliminary investigation suggests at least 30 cases across all service branches. Some officers may be completely unaware their families have been compromised. Others, like you were, may be facing false charges based on evidence planted by their own relatives. The scope was staggering. What had happened to me wasn't an isolated incident or a one-off conspiracy. It was part of a systematic campaign to destroy American military leadership from within, using the most intimate relationships as weapons. "What do you need from me?" Admiral Torres leaned forward. "We need you to lead a joint task force to investigate and dismantle this network. Your experience makes you uniquely qualified to understand how these operations work and how to protect the officers being targeted." The assignment was both opportunity and ordeal. I'd spent 10 years building a life separate from the betrayal that had nearly destroyed me. Now I was being asked to immerse myself completely in similar betrayals, to relive my own trauma while preventing others from experiencing the same destruction. But the alternative was allowing 30 officers to face what I'd faced, letting 30 families be torn apart by manipulation and conspiracy. Permitting foreign intelligence services to achieve through treachery what they couldn't accomplish through conventional espionage. "I'll do it," I said simply. The task force included representatives from all military branches, FBI counterintelligence specialists, and Treasury Department financial investigators. Our first meeting was held in a secure conference room beneath the Pentagon, walls lined with classified charts and surveillance photographs. The evidence was overwhelming and heartbreaking. Lieutenant Colonel James Wright, facing charges of selling weapon specifications, whose brother had been systematically manipulated into gambling addiction. Commander Lisa Park, accused of leaking submarine deployment schedules, whose mother's cancer treatment had been sabotaged to create crushing medical debt. Captain Robert Chin, charged with compromising communications protocols, whose daughter's drug addiction had been deliberately fostered and exploited. Each case followed the same basic pattern I'd experienced: Family financial crisis, helpful stranger offering solutions, gradual escalation of requests for information, sudden exposure and criminal charges when the officer became suspicious or resistant. The sophistication level is remarkable, FBI Special Agent Catherine Mills observed. They're not just recruiting family members randomly. They're creating the conditions that make recruitment possible, then providing solutions that seem legitimate until it's too late to back out. I nodded grimly. They studied what happened in my case and improved their methodology. Instead of relying on existing family problems, they're manufacturing crises that guarantee desperation and cooperation. The investigation consumed the next 6 months. We traced financial networks, identified Chinese intelligence operatives, documented recruitment methods, and slowly unraveled a conspiracy that reached into every level of American military leadership. The most difficult part was interviewing the compromised officers. Sitting across from Lieutenant Colonel Wright as he described his brother's betrayal was like looking into a mirror that reflected my own past. The confusion, the anger, the sense of complete isolation, I recognized every emotion because I'd experienced them all. "How do you survive it?" he asked during one of our sessions. "How do you rebuild trust when the people you love most prove they're willing to destroy you?" "You don't rebuild the same trust," I told him. "You build different trust, with different people, based on different criteria. The family you choose becomes more important than the family you were born into." These conversations were therapeutic for the officers I interviewed and surprisingly healing for me. For 10 years, I'd carried the experience alone, never fully discussing with anyone what it felt like to be betrayed so completely. Now I was helping others process similar trauma while processing my own remaining wounds. The breakthrough came when Agent Mills identified a pattern in the financial transfers. All the money used to compromise families was flowing through a network of shell companies ultimately controlled by a single Chinese intelligence unit. More importantly, the operational planning showed they were preparing to activate their compromised sources simultaneously for a major intelligence operation. "They're not just collecting information piecemeal," Mills explained during our morning briefing. "They're positioning these families to pressure their military relatives into coordinated disclosure of classified material. Something big is coming." We had perhaps weeks before 30 senior officers would face simultaneous pressure to commit treason or watch their families face financial ruin, criminal prosecution, or worse. The conspiracy I'd survived individually was about to be unleashed on a massive scale. Working with Justice Department prosecutors, we developed a coordinated response. Simultaneous arrests of Chinese operatives, protective custody for compromised family members, and most importantly, full briefings for the targeted officers about what had been done to them and their families. The operation launched on a Tuesday morning in April. FBI teams across the country executed arrest warrants, seized financial records, and began the process of dismantling 5 years of careful preparation by foreign intelligence services. I personally briefed each of the 30 targeted officers, explaining how their families had been manipulated, showing them evidence of the conspiracy, and helping them understand that they were victims rather than suspects. The conversations were difficult but necessary. These officers needed to understand they weren't alone and weren't at fault for their families' actions. The aftermath was complex and painful. Some families could be reconciled once the manipulation was exposed and the external pressure removed. Others, like mine had been, were too damaged by participation in the conspiracy to rebuild genuine trust. Each officer had to make individual decisions about forgiveness, boundaries, and what kind of family relationships were possible moving forward. 6 months later, I testified before a closed session of the Senate Intelligence Committee about the investigation. The senators were particularly interested in lessons learned and preventive measures. "Admiral Donovan, based on your experience both as a victim and as an investigator, what can be done to prevent future family-based targeting of military personnel?" Senators, the most important protection is awareness. Officers need to understand that family financial crises can be manufactured, that helpful strangers may have hostile motives, and that requests for information should be evaluated carefully regardless of who's making them. We also need better support systems for personnel facing family pressure, so they have alternatives to handling these situations alone. The Chinese intelligence network was dismantled, but the damage to individual families was irreparable in many cases. 30 officers learned what I'd learned a decade earlier, that survival sometimes requires choosing professional integrity over family loyalty, and that the strongest relationships are those built on proven character rather than biological connection. As I flew back to my headquarters in Norfolk, I reflected on how the assignment had changed me. For 10 years, I'd carried my experience as a private burden, something that shaped my decisions but remained largely separate from my professional duties. Now it had become the foundation for protecting an entire generation of officers from similar destruction. The conspiracy that nearly ended my career had ultimately enabled me to save 30 others from the same fate. The betrayal that shattered my family had given me the knowledge necessary to help other families survive similar attacks. Sometimes the worst things that happen to you become the source of your greatest contributions to others. Sometimes survival itself becomes a form of service. The court cleared my name, but the lesson was louder than any verdict. Trust is earned, even in a family. If this resonated, tap like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs a reminder that boundaries are strength. Quick questions for you. If a parent testified against you, what would you do first? Fight, forgive, or walk away? Have you ever been falsely accused? How did you prove the truth? Where do you draw the line between family loyalty and personal integrity? What's one boundary you wish you'd set sooner? Drop your answers in the comments, I read them. And hit the bell so you don't miss the next story.